Well, thank you so much to our seniors for their leadership in our worship today. Thank you, Roger, for sharing. Thank you for those that, honestly, for weeks have been practicing to make this possible. So thank you so much. The other day, I was at Sam's with a couple of the boys just getting some items that we needed. And I had gotten everything that I came to get, and I was coming off of an aisle, and I was beginning to head towards the front of the store to be able to check out and to leave. As I do so, there's this lady who has got a white lab coat on who stops me. And I don't know why it is that we just, and I guess it's just because of our experience having gone to the doctor, anybody wearing a white lab coat, we just give them credence. We think, oh, that person's smart. They know what they're doing, right? I mean, this could be, I don't know, the guy that cuts your grass wearing a white lab coat, then you would listen to them very, very differently. Anyway, so she didn't really ask. She just kind of said, hey, I need you, I just need your attention for a brief moment. And and as she begins to talk, I can tell what's going on. She's at an end cap on the end of an aisle, and she's got some skin care merchandise that she is hawking, and she's got her white lab coat on to make it look all legit and professional and dermatological. And so anyway, she says, can I see your wrist for a second? And so I put my wrist out, and then she, out of her lab coat, pulls some type of lotion, and she puts it on my wrist, and then she's starting to just rub this on my wrist for, easily at least a minute, maybe longer than a minute. And I'm listening to what she's saying, but I'm also thinking, why is this stranger rubbing my arm? And candidly, she didn't really ask. It just kind of happened. And I'm thinking, what would Caroline think about this? Anyway, so she's talking, and she's continuing to rub this lotion in vigorously, and she's talking about how dermatologists recommend that you have a skin mask, face mask, I think she said twice a week. And I remember thinking, she doesn't know what dermatologists say. Anyway, but she's got a white lab coat on. She's still rubbing my wrist. And she's done this. She's been talking for at least a minute, maybe longer than that. She's been at this now for a while, and she stops and she says, see, look what all that has done. And there's some little pieces of dead skin that have popped up, or like little balls of dead skin. But honestly, if you get a little bit of dirt and rub your wrists, you're going to get some dead skin. Anyway, so she's like, ooh, you see that? And I said, oh, yeah. And so then she wipes that off, and I'm thinking I'm about done, but then she pulls out another and puts round 2 on. And at this point, this is I don't know what this is. And so she's rubbing this on there, and she's talking about how this is a limited time that she's able to be there. And normally this would sell for $169, but management has authorized that she could sell this for $89. And it's good for a year, whole year's worth of stuff in these 2 little bottles. Management has authorized. Still talking, still rubbing this, and I'm still thinking, why is this stranger rubbing my wrist? And so finally she stops and she says, now hold your other wrist out. You said, you see the difference? And I said, help me. And she said, you see how shiny this one is? How much shinier it is? I said, yeah, that one still got lotion all over it. And ultimately I said, I appreciate it, man, but honest to goodness, I am just not your customer. I'm just not. And so I thanked her and went on my way. And I was thinking, why in the world would somebody buy this after having stood there now for several minutes? And honestly, I've never had my wrist rubbed like that before in my life. Never will again. And she spent all this time and effort and energy rubbing my wrist, and there is no difference. There is no difference. And I would expect, especially if you're hawking some wares, and if you've been at this for multiplied minutes and using supposedly a great product, you would expect to see that there is a difference. You would expect, after you've done this for a little while, that you would see that there is some effect. Today is what we've called Senior Adult Sunday. And whether it is you're a senior or not, whether you are a senior or hope one day to be a senior, there is in that thought a principle that I believe should ring true for each of us. If you are here as a follower of Jesus, the longer you have lived and the longer you have lived as a follower of Jesus, the more it should be true that you ought to see a difference. She's done this for, I ought to see that there is a difference. If you do this living thing, and not simply living, but living as a follower of Jesus for any lengthy period of time, it ought to be that there are some differences you could, and ultimately should see. But what is it that you should expect to see? Look with me in your Bibles this morning to Deuteronomy chapter 34. Deuteronomy chapter 34. After the service, I'll be rubbing wrists in the lobby. Management has authorized. I don't have a white lab coat. I'll just get an old choir robe. So I'll see you in the lobby. Deuteronomy 34. Then Moses went up from the plains of Moab to Mount Nebo to the top of Pisgah, which faces Jericho. And the Lord showed him all of the land. That verse and the next few verses continue to describe some of the places and cities. Verse 4, the Lord said to Moses, "This is the land I promised Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I will give it to your descendants. I will let you see it with your own eyes, but you will not cross into it." So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab, according to the Lord's word. He buried him in the valley in the land of Moab, facing Beth Peor, and no one to this day knows where his grave is. Moses was 120 years old when he died. His eyes were not weak. His vitality had not left him. The Israelites wept for Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days, and then the days of weeping and mourning for Moses came to an end. And then Joshua, son of Nun, was filled with the spirit of wisdom because Moses had laid hands on him, and the Israelites obeyed Joshua and did as the Lord had commanded Moses. All right, so let me set the stage for you. Moses, at this point, is experiencing two realities. He has not only lived for a long time, but he has lived as a follower of God for a long time. When those are true statements, there are some things that you ought to be able to see. Some things that we see at work in this passage. But what exactly? Well, starting in verse 1, we're given some descriptions about how Moses goes from Moab up Mount Nebo, down the valley, then up Mount Pisgah, which faces Jericho. He does this as he is a 120-year-old man. For 55 years now, Moses has been on Social Security. He is 120 years old. And we're not told in this passage the extent to which Moses was aware of how close the end of his life was. Well, we don't know. We don't know that God said, hey, today's the day, next week is the week, next month is the month. We don't know that Moses had that kind of awareness that death was that imminent. But candidly, if you're 120 years old, you can't be surprised by death, right? The other thing is that Moses is the guy that God used to not only write Deuteronomy, but also to write Genesis. And in Genesis chapter 6, God used Moses to communicate that and with the experience of Noah, that God shortens lifespans to roughly 120 years. And Moses is now 120 years old. And so the end of his life, though he might not have known exactly when it was going to occur, had to be mindful of the fact that it was not very far away. And so Moses has lived a long time. He has lived a long time as a follower of God. And if and when those things are true, should it not be that there are some things you're able to observe? And certainly in Moses' case there was. And if those things become true of you, there's some things that you ought to see as well. But what? Well, the first thing is this. You ought to see some dividends. You ought to see some dividends. If you have followed the Lord for a period of time, there ought to be some dividends, some fruit of that experience having been a reality. As Moses is standing on top of the mountain, stretched out before him is the fulfillment of God's promises. In fact, a promise that had first given to Abraham, then to Isaac, then to Jacob, and then to Moses. It had been repeated for generation after generation. Hey, there is this land that is so inextricably linked to the promises of God that it is called the Promised Land. And God's people have been looking for this for years and years and years and years. For centuries they have been waiting for this, and now Moses is able to see it and look over into it, and that it is absolutely the fulfillment of everything God has been promising for generations. And as he sees that, you've got to think also, at 120 years old, though we're not told exactly what Moses was thinking, there's some stuff you've got to think was going through his mind. He's probably thinking, among other things, man, finally, we're seeing it. I mean, since my childhood, I've been hearing about this place that we didn't know exactly where it was. We didn't know how we would wind up getting there. We didn't know exactly what it would look like, but we heard these veiled descriptions of land flowing with milk and honey. It was a land of great promise. It was all this stuff. And we've been looking for this, and our forefathers have been looking for this for a long time, waiting for God to give this to us, and finally, I'm seeing it. Man, I mean, it's hard to believe that it's been a dream for so long, it is now a reality. You've got to think, at least in part, Moses was thinking about that. But again, he's 120 years old as well. I think it's a reasonable supposition to think that there were some other thoughts that were going on in Moses' mind. Maybe he thought back to the stories that, of course, he was so young to not know about them. He had to hear about them later from his mother, but how the Pharaoh had sought to kill all the Hebrew babies, but his mother had put him in this little raft that she had made, hoping somehow, some way, that he might be able to be saved. Puts this little baby's body in this little raft, sends it down the river, and the Pharaoh's own daughter pulls it out, and he grows up in the Pharaoh's home and having his own biological mother essentially as his nursemaid. Thinking, man, God, it's amazing how God did that. That's not by chance. That's not by coincidence. Man, it's amazing how God spared my life. Maybe it was that Moses thought about what it was like when God first put a call on his life, when he's out in the woods, and all of a sudden he hears this voice, and there is a bush that is on fire, yet not on fire, in the sense that it's not being consumed. And there's this voice that he hears that says, take your shoes off, you're standing on holy ground, and God is speaking to him and telling him, I've got plans for you. I want to use you to get my people out of slavery. I want to use you to go tell Pharaoh, hey, let my people go. Maybe Moses thought about what it was like to give excuses to God. But then finally, he does what God says. Maybe thought about the plagues and all of that. And finally, how he was able to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. But then you remember the Pharaoh changes his mind, and finally Moses has got the Israelites. They're at the banks of the Red Sea. The Pharaoh's armies are swiftly approaching from behind. It's either death by drowning or death by the sword. And then God parts the water and they walk through on dry land. Man, I mean, he's 120 years old. You got to think that some of this stuff is going through his mind. Maybe it was that he was thinking about, as he's looking at this promised land, we had no map to get here. I mean, nobody had given us, go 800 paces and turn right. And then go 900 paces and look for a tree with a big branch falling out of it and turn left. I mean, but miraculously, during the day, God had this cloud that would apparently was kind of low in the sky that they could follow. And even if they were traveling at night, somehow there was this light, this pillar of fire, whatever that is, that at night they could travel that would lead them to the promised land. But finally, he's seeing it. Finally, he's seeing it, and you got to think Moses is, at this point, realizing, man, I've had a long life. I've had a lot of years following the Lord. And as those are true, there is fruit of that. There is evidence of that. Now, that's not to suggest that the only thing that came to mind was the good stuff, the blessings, because there are absolutely multiplied instances where Moses colored outside the lines and there were adverse consequences that were brought to bear. In fact, the fact that he's not able to go into the promised land itself is an enormous consequence. Nevertheless, he has followed the Lord for a long time. God has blessed him not simply with that, but with a long life, and there is fruit of that. If and when God grants you the ability to be his follower for some lengthy period of time, there ought to be some dividends. There ought to be some tangible fruit of that experience. This past week I had some real quality time with my 3 oldest boys. They were out with me in the yard and we spread 85 bales of pine needles. You remember the passage about weeping, wailing, and gnashing of teeth? Oh, that's what it was. Holy cow, you've never heard such. One of them said this: "This is a day that will live in infamy." I don't think that's what Roosevelt had in mind. Anyway, they did not enjoy that. I didn't have a lot of fun with that. But it had been a couple of years since we had put out any pine needles, and anywhere where they had been, honestly, it was almost down to dirt and weeds and all kinds of mess. And finally, we get all of these things spread out. But once you spread pine needles, one of the things that you want to do also is to get a blower and come back and you roll or tuck the edges. So then you've got a clean border. At that point, the boys have finished. They've already gone in the house, and I get the blower and I roll all the edges. And at that point, everything is done. The boys are in the house, and then I called them, though, out in the yard, and they said, well, what do you want? Hoping that there's not another 15 bales of needles. And I said, hey, I just want you to step out here with me and look at this and see how much nicer it looks. And I just want you to know that when you work hard, there should be some benefit. And this is the benefit of hard work. Moses, at this point, and this is not to suggest that what he is seeing is what he has done. What he's able to see is that after all these years of following the Lord and sacrifice and giving and serving and walking, that God has been able to work through him, and there's been repeated instances where God has been able to do things of real consequence, and there is a payoff. There is a real dividend, and you're able to look back and say, man, look at what the Lord has done. Look at these blessings. Look at these experiences that have only been able to be experienced because God has done something and because I have been walking with him. If you're here today as a young person that you hope one day to live to your senior years, understand this. You will not get to a point like Moses where you're able to see what God has done by chance. You won't just stumble into seeing the byproduct of faithful service to the Lord. You'll get to that point because of intentional decisions and choices you make along the way, and whether it is that you are going to take seriously this idea of following the Lord. Now that's for younger people. But what about you who are seniors? If you were to go up Mount Pisgah and to look out and to think back not only on your years of living, but some of you have known the Lord for literally decades. What is it that you can see? What is the dividend? What is the payoff? What is the fruit and the byproduct of those years of walking with the Lord? And let me just say this very candidly. If nothing comes to mind, that is a real problem. If you have known the Lord and walked with God for decades and you can't think of repeated instances of what it is that God has been able to do in and through your life, ways in which He was able to do something and make a difference in your life, I'm telling you, that is an enormous problem. That being said, the past cannot be undone. But so long as you're here, it's time to start making some different choices. So that if God lets you live long enough, lets you get a little further down the road, you're able to see, because of some different choices, that there's some real dividend. If you've known the Lord for a period of time, if you've lived long enough, you ought to see some dividends, but there's something else that you ought to see, and that's that you should see the engine is still running. You should see the engine is still running. What do I mean by that? Verse 7 tells us at death that Moses is 120 years old. Not only does it tell us that, but it says his eyes were not weak and his vitality had not left him. So what does that mean? Well, among other things, Moses probably didn't have cataracts, right? If his vision was not dim, his eyes haven't got clouded by cataracts, he's still able to see really well. Which, the fact that is described suggests that this was unusual, that anybody else that was 120 years old, it was kind of like this. So not only could he see well, but it says that his vitality had not left him. That Moses was still fairly strong dude. I mean, he's in still pretty good physical shape. How do we know that? Well, he's just climbed 2 mountains. Some of you had trouble this morning climbing 2 stairs, right? Moses is 120. He's on his 2nd mountain now. That suggests something about Moses' physical condition. And maybe you say, well, man, there's no way that's going to be me. If by chance, somehow, some way I get to be 120, I mean, they will drag me up a mountain. What I want you to understand, though, is that though these are obviously true statements, that Moses' eyesight was still good and that he still had a significant amount of vitality, I don't believe that we should be under any delusions that Moses was still anything other than 120 years old, every part of him. And those of you who are further down the road than me can attest to the fact that the older the parts get, the creakier they get, right? Things don't improve over time. And that certainly Moses, compared to any other 120-year-old, is doing great. But he's still 120 years old. Things are not like when he was 60. They're not like they were when he was 40. Certainly not like they were when he was 20. Yeah, compared to other 120 years old, man, Moses is doing great. But he's still 120 years old. And even with that being, I believe, evident to people who would see Moses, that there's a lot of wrinkles, there's a lot of gray hair, or maybe no hair. I don't know what Moses' smile looked like after 120 years old. He had a really pretty tooth. He's 120 years old. And even though in great shape, still dramatically affected by all of that age. But what's going on? Moses is still leading the people. Up until this very day, he has still been pouring into, he has still been sharing godly wisdom. He has still been making decisions. He's still been doing stuff. Moses, even at 115 years, didn't say, wait a minute, time out. I'm just too old. I've just been doing this too long. It's somebody else's turn. I'm just done with this. No, the motor is still running. Now, don't misunderstand me. Again, it may not be running smoothly. The motor might have backfired every once in a while, right? But the motor is still running. He's still pouring in and still investing in people. Now, honestly, this is something that I have had repeated conversations with seniors over the years where they say, you know what, I don't understand why it is that God still has me here because, honestly, I can't do anything. I can't do anything. And And I believe that to be a reasonable supposition. It's a reasonable thought. It's a reasonable observation. It used to be that I was doing all kinds of stuff, but now I don't know why he has me here, because I can't do anything. And the thought is this: if I can't do what I once did, well, then I can't do anything. If I can't do what I once did, then I can't do anything. I don't believe Moses was able to do at 120 what he once did, but he's still doing. The point, I believe, is this: even though the manner of service changes with time and age, there still ought to be service. Physical constraints, physical limitations obviously affect that, but sometimes it is that you have to get creative and say, God, help me to see ways in which it is that I can use you. And let me just give you an example. I didn't ask her for permission, so that way she couldn't say no. Someone asked for forgiveness, maybe then permission. But after this past Wednesday morning's Bible study, Barbara Connor shared with me something that's been going on in her life recently. And I don't know exactly what Barbara's age is, but she's further down the road than me, all right? And she said this: I have wondered how it is that God could use me, because there's so much I can't do. I can't get around like I used to. I can't interact with people like I used to. And God impressed me with something, though. And that is that I get all of these solicitation phone calls. People hawking a credit card, people trying to sell you an upgraded plan of cable, people trying to sell you this, that, or the other. And she said, I'm getting all of these calls, and it's not like she's going out after them. They're coming as uninvited guests into her home. And so what she realized is, you know what? They're coming to me on the phone, and God helped her to see, that's an opportunity that I can have to share with them about what I know about Jesus. And she began to share with me, just in the past week, a conversation she had with somebody who called to sell her something, and was able to have a wonderful conversation with this person about what it is that God has done. And candidly, most of the time what we do is to see it's a race to hang up, right? How quickly can I hang up on this person? I don't want this phone call. And what very easily could have been a nuisance and an aggravation, God helped her to see, hey, this is an opportunity. An opportunity that I believe, quite frankly, were it not for that stage in life, you'd have said, oh, that's useless. That's an aggravation. That's an annoyance. What we need to be mindful of is this: if we have walked with the Lord for a lengthy period of time, if we have lived for a lengthy period of time, it ought to be that there's some byproduct, some fruit of that. And one of the things that you ought to see is that the motor is still running. Maybe not going down the same roads, maybe not going as fast, but still going. And maybe it is this morning, if you say, I've been struggling with this, wondering how it is that God could use me because there's so much I can't do. Listen, God's not surprised by that. I hope you understand. God knows exactly what's going on with you. But still, I believe the fact that He has you here, there are ways in which He can use you. So will you just say, Lord, help me to see some of that? I know it's not some of the stuff that used to be. That season of time, that season of opportunity is gone. So what's the new one that you want me to see? You ought to see that the motor is still running. The last thing you ought to see based on this is this. You ought to see a baton ready to pass. You ought to see that there's a baton ready to pass. Moses dies. Verse 8, it says that the people went for Moses, and there is a season of mourning that lasts for 30 days. Moses was loved by the people. There's entire generations now that the only leader they have ever known is Moses. This is the guy that had led their parents or grandparents out of slavery in Egypt. This is the one that God used to give the law. This is the guy that, this is not his first mountain. This is the one where Moses went up Sinai and brought the tablets, where God etched in stone His expectations. This is the guy that was able to catch a glimpse of God as He passed by on the mountain. And now He's gone. They're affected, to be sure. They're sad. They miss Him. They loved Him. They respected Him. And so Moses is dead and gone, and what happens? Israel as a nation is now just a jalopy, and the wheels have fallen off, right? They just say, woe is me, I don't know what we're going to do. Let's just, oh shucks, let's just join another country. We'll merge with somebody else. Moses is gone, that's it. Let's turn the lights out. That's what happened, right? No, that's not what happened at all. In fact, it seems that the people don't miss a beat at all because verse 9 says, Joshua, son of Nun, was filled with the spirit of wisdom. And it says, because Moses had laid hands on him. This is indicative of what had happened years before, as not simply Moses lays his hands on, but that's also describing the fact that God has chosen and used Moses to anoint Joshua as the next leader of Israel. And what seems clear is that God has been using Moses and the time he has given to Moses to invest in, to pour in, to lead, to guide, to share counsel, to share experience with Joshua, so that when Moses is dead and gone, what do people miss? I mean, they miss Moses, but they don't miss a beat as a people, do they? No, that they pick up. In fact, Joshua's getting ready to as the book of Joshua begins to share with them, hey, this is what God wants us to do, and they're getting ready to take Jericho. How'd that happen? Because Moses had been thinking about, you know what, I'm not going to be here forever. And he invested in younger generations. He was intentional in thinking about passing the baton. Let me just be honest. My only experience with a baton was in middle school in gym class. And I remember you did have these units on different sports, but I remember in a track and field unit, we would do some relay races. And we were out on the school track, and you'd have like 4 people that would be each an individual leg in the relay. And so one person would run, and they'd be running with a baton, and then they would pass it off to a second person, a third person, and the fourth person would be the finisher. But it wasn't just kind of by chance or by accident how this whole baton passing thing would work. And that is that you would have the first runner who's running in their lane. Let's say they're in the second lane, and so they're going to stay in that lane. But then there is an area where there would be a line in that lane. And the second runner would begin before the first runner ever got to begin to run and start to pick up speed. And so they're beginning to acclimate, and then they're going to put their hand back like this while the one with the baton passes the baton into their hand, and then it's a smooth exchange from 1 to 2, from 2 to 3, 3 to 4. The race doesn't stop. It is the intention is a smooth exchange from one to another, to another, to another. Candidly, each of us, to varying degrees, has difficulty with this. And I'll be honest with you, this is a problem that I have as well. A real problem that I have in helping to equip other people to do stuff that I may be presently doing. A lot of times what we do is that we have the stuff it is that we're doing with and for God, that God is working through us to do. And we do that, and we do it, and we do it, and we do it. We keep doing it, we keep doing it. Others may volunteer to help. Others may ask, can they help? Oh, no, I got this covered, got this covered, got this covered. And sometimes we may even complain about the amount of stuff that's on our plate. I've been there too. Man, I got too much junk on my plate. And what we're failing in oftentimes is seizing the opportunity to invest in others, to equip them to also do the work of ministry so that we can pass the baton on to them. And ultimately, I believe there's 2 reasons that we would fail to do that. There's 2 thoughts that we would have that would prevent us from seeking to pass the baton. And the first one is this. We think we're going to live forever. Either we think that, and so I just need to keep doing this because I'm going to live forever, which that's false, right? Or we think, secondly, I am indispensable and no one but me can do this. If we are ceasing to invest in others to pass the baton, either one of those 2 thoughts is what we think. And so if the thought is, hey, I'm not going to live forever, then it must be the other. It must be, I think I am indispensable and no one can do this possibly like me. But both of those are absolutely false statements. Moses, as he is getting ready to die, is looking out on top of the mountain, able to think back on ways in which he has seen God at work throughout his life. And you got to think, though there's absolutely moments of failure that cross his mind, there's so much that he could say, Lord, I'm so blessed and so grateful to have been there to see you do this, to see you do that. There were some real dividends. But I think one of the things that also gave Moses the ability to pass from this life into eternity with absolute peace was this confidence. The people are ready for somebody else to lead them. Because God has used me to pour into the next generation, because I'm not going to live forever and I am not indispensable. Do you know that? Do we individually and collectively know that? We're not going to live forever and none of us is indispensable. Well, when we know that, it will lead us to be intentional about pouring into somebody else so that when we are gone, when we have left the scene, that the work is able to continue from one generation to another to another. Anytime you have done something for any period of time, there ought to be some evidence that you've been doing this for a period of time. That's what we started with. And I finished with that same thought. Some of you, as seniors, have not only been living, but living as a follower of the Lord for a lengthy period of time. Let me ask you, what evidence is there of that? If it is nothing, if it is comparatively little, maybe God is saying to you, in the time that you have left, let's start making some different decisions. For those who aren't there, whether you're middle-aged, whether you're teenage, wherever you are in this, do you want to wind up experiencing what Moses was able to experience? After walking with the Lord for a long time, that there is real, tangible benefit. There is real and tangible fruit of that. Then you understand, listen, I'm not going to get there by chance. Maybe today it's time to start making some choices to help me get there. Will you bow your heads with me?